if you cast your mind back, actually, I had a bit of a front row seat on some of this, because if you remember the row about benefits uprating, particularly sort of took life. And so in my brief I actually had one of the kind of, sort of top.
In fact, I remember Penny Mordaunt
items.
came on my show and said that she thought it should rise in line with benefits.
Indeed, everybody had an opinion.
Not government policy.
Quite, and so we ended up with a pretty ill-disciplined situation where actually lots of people were stating their opinion, and you can't work like that.
Yeah. So, Chloe Smith, welcome to your exit interview. Obvious first question, why are you leaving?
For me, it's about looking for some fresh challenges, but it's also actually about a sort of a family decision. So I've had a wonderful opportunity to do a whole series of things in politics. I've been in for 5 terms. The people of Norwich North, I'm extremely grateful to. They have asked me to do that 5 times. But actually, for me personally, that's been interspersed with quite a lot of other personal issues, like the last particular series of elections, which I'm sure all of us in politics have experienced quite intensely. But for me, actually, that was more like election, maternity leave, election, cancer, pandemic. And in fact, it's time to take stock and do things a little bit differently.
We'll come to all of that in a moment. Let's go right back to your first time then, because you were elected in a by-election in 2009, called as a result of the MP's expenses.
Yes, indeed.
Which feels like a lifetime ago.
Well remembered. Yeah.
What was it like coming into politics at that point? Obviously, the Conservatives sort of riding high in the polls, but politicians in general not the most popular people in the world. What was that? And you were young. You were sort of still in your 20s. So what was it like coming into that quite febrile atmosphere?
Indeed, it was febrile, and you're absolutely right. The public appetite around politics was pretty low, pretty angry, and actually I think rightly so, as it happens. What was also going on, politically speaking, was that there was a few by-elections in a sequence which sort of marked the start of David Cameron's coming into government. So inside the kind of Conservative family, there was quite a positive feeling actually around that sequence of by-elections, and I'm very close friends still with the likes of Ed Timpson, who was one of the other ones in Crewe and Nantwich, and actually we had dinner the other night with another person who'd been a helper to us both in those instances. So quite a sort of building feeling of the Conservatives being able to carry people's trust, and that being shown through the by-elections and onwards to the general election. For me personally, as you say, I was 27, I was extremely young. I was baby of the house at the time, although have now since been roundly beaten, of course, for that particular crown. But what that did mean at the time, actually just for that last year before that then election, was that it was sort of somewhat unusual on the benches. So not only do you come in obviously at the bottom of the tree in terms of experience, and you've just got to learn a lot quickly, as in any organisation, but also in this case I was quite, notably younger than almost everybody else. I think my closest fellow Conservative was 10 years older than me.
Yeah.
And so I just had to sort of build the relationships that I could, and of course also turn back round again in about 9 months to go back to Norwich North and say, please would you have me again, which I'm delighted that they did, and as I say have done so 5 times. But all of that happening quite intensely in one go. It's
interesting actually. I suppose we sort of forget that you were elected into the sort of the Michael Howard party, elected in 2005, and the big change didn't come until 2010. And what was that like? I was looking up at one point, you were very young. The Daily Mail called you a Cameron cutie. Which struck me as, I sort of thought, that was only 2000. It doesn't feel like it was that long ago, and yet it's got a dated,
very dated
thing. How did all that feel? I mean, do you think it's sort of the generation before that we had Blair's Babes, and you sort of felt we'd moved on from that?
You would hope that we had moved on from these things, absolutely. I mean, as it happens, I personally took some inspiration from David Cameron becoming the leader of our party, and if you remember, he put out the call saying we need more women in our party, we need to modernise our party, and I said, yeah, I'm up for that, count me in, I'd like to be part of that. And in due course that led to being on the candidates list and being elected. But yeah, I never had much patience with the whole Cameron cutie thing, and the associated concepts of the A-list and all that. I mean, just, there are good people, there's great talent, you want to be able to build a party out of that because fundamentally it's about public service and about having really good people in a fresh generation coming to do that.
Do you think, because you came in on your own in a by-election with lots of attention on you,
yes,
and phrases like Cameron Cooper, do you think that held you back in any way, that you were seen as the young novelty MP rather than a part of a cohort that would then rise through the ranks?
Well, it's certainly true that as a by-election winner, you are solo. That's just a fact of it. And I think there's probably a few of us around the place who have recognised that fact. And occasionally we band ourselves together, which is the best you can do with that. But I think it's probably objectively the case that no, it didn't hold me back. I was asked quite rapidly to go into government, into the Whip's office, on the very first day, of course, of government in May 2010, and then onwards straight into ministerial work. So I don't think it could be said to have held me back. But what I have said, in other contexts since, is that actually, you've got to respond to that challenge. Being offered such a role early on means you need to be able to get into it fast. You need to be able to marshal your experience, your credibility, your approach, your achievements in order to repay, the trust that is being put in you. You don't sort of flounce around and say, I'm just the 27-year-old. You do a damn good job if you can.
With hindsight, was it too fast?
I've said in at least one other context that there's a few moments of embarrassment that I would look back on in those first couple of years.
Right,
we're all young once.
Let's deal with this.
Let me guess which one you're going to go for.
You were
first.
put in the Treasury, like you said, very quickly, very young.
Yeah.
George Osborne was the Chancellor. It was a time of austerity and trying to balance the books and so on. And you got what going to describe as the hospital pass of going on Newsnight. After the government had changed its position on, was it on fuel duty?
It was fuel duty.
But you were the one who carried the can, and you basically got monstered by Jeremy Paxman. How did that happen? Because it felt like it wasn't your fault. You were just the one who was ultimately stuck on the telly. You didn't make the decision. You weren't involved in the decision, but you were the one who basically got sort of publicly shredded.
I think that's probably about accurate. And it's also probably about par for the course, actually, for a junior minister in a department. You do a portion of the, of the rough work, and you don't. Well, by definition, it is not you that is accountable at the at the top of the tree. I take a couple of conclusions from it. One is that you're there to learn hard and fast and improve, and you show me somebody else who hasn't improved from their 20s through their 30s through their 40s. I'm pretty comfortable as I sit here now, and I think I've done a good job over the years. But when I was early 20s, late 20s, were there things I could have been better at straight away? Of course there were. But the other conclusions actually also, I think even Jeremy Paxman has drawn them himself, which is that he didn't always have the most constructive interviewing style. And I'll tell you one other thing for free as well, which is that actually it wasn't even the most important thing happening in my week. That week, my father had got a diagnosis of bowel cancer.
Oh, wow.
There are other things going on that kind of knock that into perspective. I'm, very, very happy with the contribution I've made since then in other ways. And the School of Hard Knocks is fine as a place to start. When
you were told, right, you're going on Newsnight tonight, and you were essentially in a situation where, and it's a weird way that political interviews, but they still play out a bit like this, where both you and Jeremy Paxman, have to pretend something is the case, that you were in some way involved in this decision. You can't admit you were involved in the decision to change policy. He has to not acknowledge you weren't involved because then he's got nothing to ask you. Right. What's going through your mind? You go in, you sit down, you put your microphone on. It's Jeremy Paxman. What's going through your mind at that point?
Well, I think two things, and this is just sort of hazy recollections from the time. One is that actually it had been an extremely long day. So as you do when you're a junior minister, in that day, and I think broadly in that week, there'd also been oral questions in Parliament on the very same stuff. I'd been handling Bill Committee for the Finance Bill that day. That Newsnight one was not even the first interview I'd done that evening. It was not, it was not the only thing I was seeking to kind of, execute on that day. But the second thing, really, that actually I recall very clearly was going through my mind was, here is a context, and quite possibly here is a bloke who doesn't do very much driving. You know, the people who really care about fuel duty are going to get some money off that, and that is an important and sensible thing that exists beyond the M25 here. Yeah. Beyond the, I shouldn't use a road analogy for that, but you know, beyond the bubble here. Yeah. And I just thought, you know, this is going at the wrong angle. Yeah, yeah. You know, people who really mind about this would quite like to hear about the policy itself rather than the he said, she said.
Rather than the inside baseball stuff. Did George Osborne pick up the phone and apologise for you taking the flag?
I'm going to say no more about it. Some secrets can go on. I like George.
That sounds no.
We've met in the years since. I like George.
Did you think it made you a better minister ultimately?
I hope so.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I suppose actually better for it to happen when you were a junior minister and it wasn't really your fault than people being parachuted into the cabinet and having their, you know, we see that in both front benches. Sometimes people who haven't come up through and had some, you know, knocks and blows on the way up through, they suddenly feel very exposed at the end of it.
It is, as you know, probably you and my mother would both say, you know, you put it down to experience.
Yeah, put it down to experience. Well, let's talk about your experience there, because you're so right. That being, you know, being an MP and a minister, you know, like you said, you're also a human being, and during that period you had children, and then how did you make that work? We'll come on in a moment to how you were later maternity cover in the cabinet. How did that work with you fitting, you know, bluntly, politics is not a very family-friendly job at the best of times, taking maternity leave and feeling able to come back and juggling that. Did you, was that tough?
It is challenging, yeah, and it's, I think as a workplace it's got many strides to take actually until it matches just, in fact, what's normal in most workplaces, most organisations, in terms of supporting maternity or parental leave. It's come on though in that time, and actually I can say that with a bit of authority, in the sense that I had my first child while a backbencher, my second child while a minister. In that very time the proxy voting system came in and got developed. And then latterly, you know, I've finished my work in Parliament by giving maternity cover to a friend in her cabinet position, you know, which was the first policy department in which we'd done that. A small piece of law, in fact, had been changed to allow that along the journey. So, you know, it's improved. There definitely has been improvement in how Parliament and government does this stuff. I think there's still a long way to go, though. And I must say, you know, that is part of the reasons for me seeking to move on, which is, you know, quite simply, I want to be at the nativity plays. I want to do the school run. Yeah. I think it's really important. I'm not prepared to kind of not be there, you know, in those years of my kid's life. And I'd like to carry on making a contribution, you know, of some significance. But part of that will be in my kid's life. And part of that, I hope, will be in other spheres as well.
Just on that, when you were covering science and technology for Michelle Dolan, how does that work? I mean, the fact you're friends obviously helps, but some days you'd be making a decision, and because, you know, the ultimate, you know, that pyramid's government departments, and the minister who sits at the top of the, you know, making the decisions. So did you have to check with Michelle? Did you second guess? Did she give you a sort of list of do's and don'ts and red lines? You know, this is when you need to call me. This is when. How did it work when, you know, the machine is shoveling stuff up the pyramid the whole time?
Yeah, indeed. So in part we were kind of putting down the road and driving on it. You know, we were writing the book as
exactly, because no one had done it before.
Well, not quite true. It had been done before, and in actual fact, I'm going to give you a trailer here of the fact that I'm writing about this with the Institute for Government on the sort of history of how this works and how it can be done in the future. So it had been done, but actually just not with formal cover. So there are people in a prior generation who you know, had children while serving in the cabinet, but there just wasn't a formal cover. What Michelle and I did was to take quite a structured approach. Probably that's character driven from the pair of us. We had a really clear communication from the outset about what we wanted to do in that time. And the piece that I brought was to say, do you know what, this is Michelle's job. You know, you could, of course you could walk into these situations and say, oh great, you know, I've arrived, I'm going to lord it for 12 weeks. I just thought that would be entirely inappropriate. This is Michelle's role. So my job here is to deliver really smartly and really well on the things that are her priorities. So we took an approach that did that. What was also really good was that everybody else around us was entirely in line with that as well. So the permanent secretary was super supportive. The civil service worked really well to make the machine do what the machine had to do to do in this environment. I and one or two others, ensured that Michelle was kept informed. Legally and constitutionally speaking, the decisions rested with me. I was the Secretary of State. That's the bottom line of it. But I made sure that it was, delivering Michelle's programme and able to hand back to her some pretty good work.
Well, it's fascinating. Hopefully, it's set the path for other people to feel more
really
able to do it.
So.
You mentioned you're diagnosed with cancer. You're diagnosed with breast cancer, and I just wondered, really, knowing people who've been through that, it's such a huge personal thing. The fact that on top of that you have to sort of put out a press release about it and deal with everyone knowing your most personal traumatic business, that must have been really difficult, but particularly for I know you're a private person, but knowing that you had to put it out in the world, it's not just something that your family can come around you and sort of support you in that way.
It's a good observation and a true observation, I think. However, quite quickly it became clear that this was quite a powerful thing, because if you are a public figure and you do feel able to use that platform to say these things, then a couple of things follow. Some people will see some comfort in that for themselves, and I know for sure that there were many, because they came to tell me this, that they had found it really reassuring, indeed even inspiring, to be able to see that that you can sort of still do what you've got to do around cancer. I wouldn't, by the way, say that my position means that everybody has to work through cancer. I was very fortunate to have had a diagnosis at the start where the doctors were saying, right, this is fixable. Obviously that puts you in a different mental position to what many others have to deal with. But the other thing that also happens is you get a heck of a lot of kindness of strangers. And actually this was lovely, because as a constituency MP, you get a lot of people saying
exactly.
So,
and as a politician, that's nice.
Rare.
Right, I want to talk to you about the... We'll return to politics. We've done a lot of the personal. We'll turn to the politics. As it's your exit interview, let's go through some of your bosses, because you've had quite a few, as have all Conservative MPs. Sum up David Cameron in a word.
I think David Cameron had good judgment. I associate good judgment with him. Although the biggie is was his judgment in the 2016 referendum correct? But I think overall he did have that.
Very good. What about George Osborne in a word?
Well, boss as Chancellor, not boss as Prime Minister.
Boss as Chancellor.
Clever.
Theresa May in a word.
Diligent.
Very good. Boris Johnson in a word.
Mercurial.
These are excellent words, because they sort of could mean anything.
Well, mercurial, actually, if you want to have the argument. I say that because actually that's kind of the point about Boris. He was very, very good at some things, clearly not good at other things, and actually in due course that became his downfall. His own actions sort of led him there. But isn't that kind of the point about him? He did try to do anything and everything.
Liz Truss in a word.
Driven, and I've reflected quite a bit on this one. I say driven and I want to be quite specific about this. She was driven to achieve high things for the country, and particularly economically. And what she would say to all of us as ministers or as members of her team, she would say, how can we do more? Here's the level of ambition I want us to be hitting. Can you do that? Can you do more? Can you do more? So I say driven in a positive sense, because her character was always leading her on like that.
Was she too driven? She sort of had her foot on the accelerator too much all at once.
I think that's probably that's pretty well documented.
Were you because you joined a cabinet as working pension secretary? Presumably you went into that. This is all quite exciting. New prime minister. Draw a line of the Boris Johnson business, as we'll call it. When did you realise it wasn't going quite as well as you hoped?
Well, I think if you cast your mind back, actually, I had a bit of a front row seat on some of this, because if you remember the row about benefits uprating, particularly sort of took life. So in my brief I actually had one of the kind of sort of
top. In fact, I remember Penny Mordaunt
items.
came on my show and said that she thought it should rise in line with benefits.
Indeed, everybody had an opinion.
Not government policy.
Quite, and so we ended up with a pretty ill-disciplined situation where actually lots of people were stating their opinion, and you can't work like that.
Yeah. So is that where you thought this is not going to hold together?
Not necessarily, but I certainly thought this is not going as it ought to. You know, we've got a job to do.
Finally, then, Rishi Sunak in a word.
Yeah, details, Mr. Details. In a good way. I think that's a character strength of his, and I particularly saw it actually when I came in to do the science, innovation, and technology role. Not only, as I was saying, was I trying to deliver the programme and priorities for Michelle, but actually it was very clear that through her, these are the Prime Minister's kind of personal interests and hopes, and in him you have somebody who is always going to look for the correct detail in a policy. That's a good thing. And somebody therefore who's quite determined to see it through on those bases. Obviously he's got a pretty tough political situation. There's no denying the kind of breadth of that, but he's got some real character strengths, I think.
Have you been surprised at things in 2020? He started the year, he hadn't been in the job for very long, he set out his 5 pledges, his certainly from the focus groups within our shows, if not the polling, showed that people were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. He was, cleaning up from what had gone before. Have you been surprised that it hasn't really, in the 12 months it followed, shifted opinion polls? That the public, maybe they just made up their mind after the Boris Johnson, Liz Truss business that no one could have shifted it. Have you been surprised that he hasn't managed to find some way of reconnecting with the public?
I wouldn't put it quite like that, and so therefore it's not quite surprised on that basis. What I think is happening is you've got some really deep-seated problems through the economy still, whether that's the labour market or whether that's inflation, much of which is globally shared. That is without a doubt true. And much of which is kind of globally sustained, as the war in Ukraine particularly, continues. So you've got these underlying factors that I think are much bigger in people's minds actually than mere politics. And you've also got the situation, and I see this in my own constituency, I see this on the doorsteps pretty clearly, and I think you also see it in opinion polls, where in fact there's quite a large number of people who haven't made their minds up yet. And that's, as it always is, people don't often turn around and think about politics until, closer to a particular time. And I see a lot of that at the moment. So, am I surprised that Rishi has still quite a sort of tough environment in front of him? No, not surprised by that. But equally, I think it was always going to be a journey of this kind of length, because people are, I think, to an extent, reserving their judgment actually about some of these pretty big issues going on.
Let's round off with some classic exit interview questions. Do you think we equipped you properly to handle your job? Do we as a country, as a political system, make it easy to be an MP and a minister?
Yes and no. So yes, in the sense that if you apply for this job and you're lucky enough to be asked to do this job by your constituents, you should have been learning all the time, and you should crucially have been listening to your constituents and able to absorb their experience and learn from them, and therefore be equipped to go in and serve them. Parliament, I think, does do a good job actually of supporting incoming MPs and helping them to do what they've got to do. Although I do also think that it's an institution that will face quite a lot of challenges in the years to come. Perhaps we can come back to that in a next question. Does government prepare ministers enough? I mean, I've had 2 experiences of that. I've been dropped in very quickly, and I've been able to go in a much more considered manner and set out how I'd like to do a role. The latter example being particularly with the interim case of science, innovation and technology, but also actually when I was working towards and hoping to be Work and Pensions Secretary, I've been able to think quite a bit about what I would do and what priorities would be, because I'd been second in command in the department before. But in the shorter examples, the shortest of short is that basically you go in and the next day you're up for oral questions. In fact, I've had that happen twice in my life. I've been reshuffled and then straight into orals the next day. So you just have to be able to be agile. There's no doubt about that. You've got to be able to absorb a lot of information quickly. But most of all, you've just got to be able to keep a very clear view of what it is you're there to deliver. You know, you're there to deliver the programme that people have voted for, a manifesto, it may well be that, or it may well be have been given definition in other ways. You've got to remember what you're there to do and go in and do the democratic, accountable bit of all of that, along with, I would hope, a technically good job.
Which bit of the job did you dislike the most?
I think, I think some of the sort of institutional aspects, I will just go back to this. I think, you touched earlier on about the, some of the ways in which Parliament is kind of classically not family friendly. Yeah. I do worry that Parliament will, as an institution, will find it difficult to continue to adapt to the ages that we live in. Stuff is moving faster, stuff is more complex, stuff is kind of louder than Parliament several centuries ago was set up to deal with, I think. In fact, I was reflecting recently on the sociobiologist Edward Wilson's phrase that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions and godlike technology. And I wonder very much about how Parliament will continue to be able to be as fleet of foot as I think it's going to need to be to respond to some of these things. So have I always enjoyed working in an institution that at times can be a bit sort of slow? No, there's been a few moments where I've looked at it and thought we could do better. I'll give you an example. Yeah. When we came back from, in stages as we did from COVID, there was a point where Parliament had thought about remote voting and used it for a period, which is only right because we were essentially reflecting what we were asking other workplaces to do. But then, without a great deal of time and thought, sort of snapped back into its old ways. And I thought, well, actually, that could have been a moment to reconsider and to think how we could do things better. And I would have liked it if we had.
Would you recommend this to someone else, a friend or a relation, someone you actually cared about?
What a question. Yes, I would. And in actual fact, this happened just last night. I was messaging an old friend from school and he put exactly this question. And I said yes, because public service really, really, really matters. Just because I'm leaving it or your other interviewees are leaving it doesn't mean there doesn't need to be a really great generation that comes next to take up the baton and do the next round of service for our constituents. That job will always exist and always be really important. And I do think that the constituency model, by the way, is absolutely central to the way we do accountability in this country. You look people in the eyes as you walk down the high street and you know whether you're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. So I think that really, really matters. I think the next intake and generation of constituency MPs will have a lot of challenges still to take on their shoulders. How do you do representation in an age that's changing like this? But I also think that actually government, however it is formed, will equally have a lot of those challenges on its plate. The economy will still be very challenging next year. Some of the other sort of social and technological and kind of cultural shifts that we're living and working through will mean that it's tough in public service, but it means it's just as important as ever.
So finally then, Chloe Smith, what will you do next?
Well, I'm hoping to continue with some of the kind of passions I've developed in my recent work. So for me, that's the economy, the labour market, its accessibility and inclusion. One of the things I was really proud of actually in terms of work done while in Parliament was legislating the British Sign Language Act. And also, of course, science and technology. And so I'm hoping to be able to continue making a contribution in those fields. I'll carry on speaking as well about cancer awareness and some issues associated to that. I'm only 41, so I'm really just at the midpoint, I think, of life. And I certainly want to be able to, to continue making, as I say, a contribution in those ways. I think I will be doing that more in the private sector than in the public, but I also have announced a charity trusteeship, and there'll be one or two more like that allow me to continue actually enjoying the kind of variety that you do as an MP. It's a wonderful thing about the job, but also crucially, I hope to be able to carry on contributing like that.
And spend a bit more time with your children,
yes.
Which is really important. Chloe Smith, thanks so much for joining us for your exit interview on Time 30.
Thank you.